Reforming the global financial architecture with fairer representation for developing countries has been a rallying cry for UN officials for years. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, among others, that must better reflect the realities of today. And with the implementation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals off track, from ending poverty to reducing inequalities to climate action, financing has become a key area of focus, especially for developing countries.
It means recognizing a fundamental fact. Progress is impossible without unlocking financing at scale. The recent Seville commitment reflected a commitment to get the engine of development reviving again. Through reform of the international financial architecture, real action on debt relief, and tripling the lending capacity of multilateral development banks, so countries can better access capital at scale and at a reasonable cost.
And a global debt crisis trajectory that urgently needs to be reversed.
Borrowing is critical for development, we all know that, and it does provide a means to governments to invest boldly in a better future for their people. But it is especially critical at a time when all countries are required to undertake one-off generational investments to green their economies and to build critical infrastructure. Today, borrowing is not working for many developing countries. Over 2/3 of our low-income countries are either in debt distress or at a high risk.
The UN Conference on Trade and Development, an intergovernmental organization within the UN Secretariat that promotes the economic interests of developing countries by advocating for reforms, including to address perceived biases in ratings agencies, also weighed in.
The global debt crisis has deepened. Last year, 3.3 billion people live in countries like the SDGs said that spend more on interest payments than on health or education. This year, that number is 3.4 billion. Last year, developing countries paid $847 billion in debt service. This year is 921 billion. And last year, the financing gap to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals was approaching 4 trillion. This year, it has surpassed that mark. So these are not only worsening numbers, this is development going backwards and hurting the SDGs.
The Confronting the Debt Crisis report seeks to unlock 11 actions that fall under 2 key goals: providing meaningful debt relief and preventing future crises. It further identifies 3 action levels. At the multilateral level, it calls for the repurposing of and replenishment of funds to inject liquidity into the system with targeted support for low-income countries. At the international level, establishing a platform for borrowers and creditors to engage directly. And at the national level, strengthening institutional capacity, improving policy coordination, managing interest rates, and bolstering risk management.
One level is related to the multilateral financial institutions, and we proposed specific reforms. One is related to repurposing and replenishing some of the existing funds at the multilateral development banks and the IMF to inject liquidity in the system and for countries in need. The other measure is basically providing very specific reforms in the common framework of the G20, basically to provide support to low middle income countries and to provide more of a timely action with support of funding when the funding is needed for the countries applying for support. I'm happy that this particular measure is started to get traction, and if we are concerned about Africa as a continent, for example, we should really be aware that the African continent, more than half of the 54 countries of Africa are today not low-income countries.
He also sought to provide clarity in relation to reforms countries themselves have to make in this regard, as many developing countries spend more to service their debts than they do on investing in their people, in education and healthcare, essentially in their future.
We know very well that a great deal of the problem is not just the issue of the creditors, which are very much responsible for the crisis that we're in, because they lend to countries while they know that there is a great deal of possibility of default, and they provided credit at a high interest rate, and they refused to cooperate in times of crisis. But the borrowers as well, many of them borrowed short-term with generous assumptions about directions of the cost of capital and interest rates. So there is a great deal of importance for policy coordination, capacity building, and dealing with areas related to interest rate, foreign exchange, risk management, and enhancing the capacity of debt management units.
A broad set of actions that need to work in tandem towards the stated goal.
Multilateral reforms, cooperation among borrowing countries, national level actions is a package. It's not a menu to choose from. It's a package. And if the package it can be brought forward with the solutions, we will really make a contribution to make finance and for development a reality for most of the developing countries that are struggling.
South Africa's G20 presidency arriving just 5 years ahead of the 2030 SDG deadline that member states agreed to in 2015. The UN Secretary-General told a meeting of G20 foreign ministers here at the UN last year that as the world's largest economies, they set the rules that dominate the boards of global financial institutions, and that the world was looking to them to accelerate reform of the international financial architecture that has become both outdated and unfair, pressing the need for fairer representation of developing countries in the governance of those institutions. The UN chief argued that it was the G20 that needed to lead in adequately shielding economies from global shocks and ensuring that real global safety nets were maintained, particularly for the most vulnerable. Sherwin, Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.